of Ghana. I'm glad to be the chair for this afternoon plenary session. And I want to say that we've had very exciting sessions in the morning that spans from looking at legal, financial, and institutional aspects of combining climate change adaptation and sustainable development. We also discussed issues that have to do with green recovery and sustainable transition. And then finally, we looked at indigenous peoples. Indigenous people and protected area. For this plenary session, we have two main speakers, and our first speaker is Professor Biermann Frank. He is a professor of the Global Sustainable Governance with the Copernicus Institute for Sustainable Development at Utrecht University, and in the Netherlands. He is the chair of Earth System Governance Project, which is a global transdisciplinary research network launched in 2009 under the auspices of International Human Dimension Program on Global Environmental Change. He will be making a presentation which he titles, "Which Political Aspect Has the SDGs Had So Far? Evidence from Global Science Assessment." Professor Biermann, you have 15 to 20 minutes to make your presentation, after which we'll have 5 minutes question and answering session. So for now, I would open the floor for Professor Biermann Frank to make his presentation.
Hi everyone, just to say I'll be sharing a pre-recorded PowerPoint presentation with Frank Biermann talking through his presentation today, as he's got unstable connection where he is currently, although he is here to answer your questions at the end. Just to note that the slides themselves may appear slightly low definition, so apologies in advance for that. However, his voice comes across very clearly, so bear with me while I share my screen now.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you so much for joining us in this plenary session today. My name is Frank Biermann of Utrecht University in the Netherlands, and I will spend the next 15 minutes to present the first insights of the Global Goals Impact Assessment, a meta-analysis of the steering effects that the Sustainable Development Goals had so far since 2015. This Global Goals Impact Assessment has been conducted over the last 12 months by a team of more than 60 scholars, social scientists who work on the Sustainable Development Goals and have specialized in studying these new global goals. The assessment has been governed by a steering committee that included Marianne Weisheim, Stephen Bernstein, Deb Bhattacharya, Pam Chasek, Louis Coetzee, Måns Nielsen, Andrea Ordóñez, who will speak also at this plenary session, as well as Rob Raven, Emmett Scholz, Michelle Scobie, John Thompson, John Thrace, Sebastian Treyer, and Detlef von Vuren. It was edited and brought together by Thomas Hickmann, Karel Anzenit, and myself. And the assessment has been concluded and will be published by Cambridge University Press in March 2022. So this Global Goals Impact Assessment is a joint effort of 61 authors, combining senior researchers who have worked on the SDGs and global sustainability governance more generally for a long time, together with a number of early career researchers, and also taking into account diversity in terms of gender and geography. What we did is essentially a broad assessment of more than 3,000 articles that we retrieved from Scopus, articles that in one way or the other are dealing with the SDGs. These 3,000 articles we have broadly assessed, and then we have investigated for a couple of sub-questions that I will discuss later, about 10 to 20% of these articles in more detail. And in addition, we have also brought in some gray literature that is not sufficiently covered by the Scopus publication database. And all these publications we have studied to understand the steering effects of the Sustainable Development Goals in the last 5 to 6 years. So importantly, our focus is not whether the SDGs are being achieved. Our focus is more specifically whether the SDGs had a steering effect, a political effect on actors in politics, governments, for example, but also economic actors and societal actors. And we were interested in particular in 3 types of such steering effects. Normative effects, that is, we want to know whether we find any changes in rules, changes in policies, changes in legislation because of the Sustainable Development Goals. Secondly, we looked at institutional steering effects. We wanted to know whether we could detect any changes in institutions, in institutional arrangements, in agencies, and organizations at local level, national level, and global level because the SDGs have been launched in 2015. And thirdly, we were interested in discursive effects, whether the SDGs have changed in any way the way how actors are framing their ideas, how actors are developing new insights, how knowledge is being shaped because of the SDGs. Can we find any impacts of the SDGs in discourses on sustainability at the local, national, and global level? So these were the 3 main questions that we wanted to understand in our Global Goals Impact Assessment. And we did this in 6 different areas. So we looked at the impacts of the SDGs, the normative, institutional, and discursive impacts at the level of global governance. We looked at governance at local and national level. We looked at the impacts on the integration and coherence of institutions and policies at all levels. We looked at the inclusiveness and tried to understand to what extent the SDGs have advanced and improved the inclusiveness of marginalized and vulnerable groups at national and international level. We looked at planetary integrity, to what extent the SDGs have improved the protection of the foundations, the natural foundations of our planet. And finally, we also looked at the methods and want to understand what methods are being used and how we can understand the methodological challenges better. So these 3 areas we assessed based on the 3,000 articles that we have studied in the Global Goals Assessment over a period of about 12 months. And now let me report some of the core findings. First, global governance. Here we found that in practice of international organizations and the way how UN agencies and other international organizations function, the effects of the SDGs were rarely normative and institutional, they were largely discursive. That means the SDGs were picked up in the way how actors talked about sustainability, but we couldn't find much impact yet in institutional change and normative development. We looked at the high-level political forum on sustainable development, and here we found that the SDGs have not lived up yet to the expectations of becoming an orchestrator in global governance, as many observers had expected it to become in 2015 and the years before. We identified some evidence that SDGs initiate some peer learning among governments, but the impacts of this peer learning are still difficult to ascertain. And finally, we also saw on the global level that changes often reflected long-term trajectories. That means any change in institutions or norms that we might have seen is largely related to processes that have been started well before 2015, and they are not necessarily causally linked to the launch of the SDGs in 2015. I come now to the second question that we wanted to address in the Global Goals impact assessment. And this is the implementation of multiple levels, in particular at the local and national level. And here our finding is that there is some policy change at country level, but this varies a lot from country to country. And we found that if we find change, it's quite often at the subnational level of the level of subnational authorities, such as cities and non-state actors in civil society that often assume a pioneering role. Again, similar to our findings at the global governance level, we believe that the steering effects are observable largely at the discursive level. So also at the level of subnational and national governance, we did not find major changes in the normative structures and institutional structures. The change that we observed is largely at the level of discourses. People are talking differently because of the SDGs. They're adopting the language of SDGs, but not necessarily change policies, legislation, and organizational structures. Again, also not different from global governance, we believe that institutional change often replicates existing priorities and trajectories. Change that has already been launched well before 2015, trajectories that have been put into motion before 2015 might have been a little bit reinforced by the SDGs, but not necessarily causally linked to the launch of the SDGs in 2015. They're quite often long-term developments that might have been accelerated by the SDGs or reframed by the SDGs, but definitely not caused by the SDGs per se. And also, we did not find much evidence that additional funding has been mobilized. So here also changes are largely discursive, but not necessarily institutional and normative. Coming to the third area that we looked at, interlinkages, integration and coherence. A big claim of the 2015 Agenda 2030 has been that governance has to become more coherent, policy has to become more coherent, institutions have to be better integrated. We found so far only limited empirical data on interlinkages, integration and coherence. There was a lot of conceptual debate, but not that much empirical analysis on these questions. There is some modest advance of institutional integration in some countries, but overall, looking at the entire landscape of governments and international organizations, we believe that governments and other actors fall short of enhancing policy coherence to implement the SDGs in a meaningful way so far. There's a lot of evidence that points to the barriers in public administrative systems to institutional integration and policy coherence. For example, in some studies, it has been pointed out that there are cumbersome bureaucracies, political interest is lacking, short-term political agendas, and also the ownership of the SDGs is quite different and not often there in many, many cases. We did not find many indications that the launch of the SDGs and the Agenda 2030 has changed significantly such barriers. So again, here, change is maybe there on the discursive level, but not necessarily in a very substantive way. I'm coming now to another area that we looked at, the fourth area, which is inclusiveness. The claim of the SDGs has been, and of the 2030 Agenda of the United Nations in 2015, that no one will be left behind. The core claim is that inclusiveness is being addressed, that inequalities are being removed or at least become less, And for that purpose, also SDG 10 has been designed just for the main purpose of formally reducing inequalities at the global level, but also at the national level. So we looked at this inclusiveness and want to know whether governance at local, national, and global level has become more inclusive because of the launch of the SDGs in 2015. And here we find a mismatch in many ways between the rhetoric of the 2030 agenda and the SDGs and real action when it comes to the impacts of SDGs on inclusiveness. Within countries, we found that the effects on reducing inequalities vary significantly. The SDGs have not brought additional normative and institutional steering that would promote inclusiveness. We didn't find much evidence that the SDGs have advanced the political and economic position of the poorest countries in global governance, one of the promises of the Leave No One Behind formula, but also one of the promises of SDG 10. We found some evidence that civil society organizations increasingly use the SDGs as a framework to hold governments to account. This is a positive development. And one finding also in this particular domain of research is that there is not that much research. Our research of scopers, publication databases, and snowballing thereafter has not revealed a huge amount of studies that would look at the inclusiveness and that would look at the implementation of SDG 10, or that would look at the Leave No One Behind formula. So there's a huge research gap, and we hope that more research is being conducted in the years to come to address this very, very important question. Then we looked at planetary integrity. And this is the protection of the foundation, the natural foundations of life on Earth. And we want to know to what extent the SDGs have helped in the last years to advance the protection of these important systems, such as climate change, biodiversity, ecosystems, and many others. And we found in the literature a huge amount of doubt about the steering effects of the SDGs in this area of planetary integrity, where authors in the literature argue that they are seeing a lack of additionality, a lack of ambition, and a lack of coherence. First, the authors see little evidence of whether normative and institutional change towards planetary integrity would have materialized without the SDGs. So whatever has been observed in normative institutional change is quite often, again, a continuation of trends that have been put into motion well before 2015. It's a bit business as usual, not necessarily always bad. Also, progress is being made in many multilateral environmental agreements, for example, but this is not necessarily linked to the Sustainable Development Goals. Many authors also argue that the SDGs lack ambition, and they are not sufficiently radical enough to really bring about a transformation. Many authors point, for example, to the emphasis that some of the SDGs put on the idea of economic growth at a time when many others are arguing that rather degrowth would be the right way forward. So overall, we believe that based on the scientific literature that we analyzed, the SDGs are not yet a radical game changer when it comes to advancing planetary integrity at global level. And finally, we looked at the methods, and quite detailed, and tried to understand what are the methods that are being used to study the SDGs. And here we identified essentially two different groups of methods. Methods that explore the effects of the goals on actors and institutions from global to local, and methods that seek to measure whether societies are on track to achieve SDGs. So these are two different ones. Methods that look at whether the SDGs are being achieved, and methods that try to assess the steering effects of the goals in the way that we try to understand and study in our assessment. Methods are quite distinct still. And in our assessment, in the chapter in our book in which we review this, there's quite a lot of information about these different methods. We did not find that much evidence of mixed methods and interdisciplinary collaboration. Believe that this is certainly important and absolutely the way forward, especially bringing together quantitative and qualitative research, modeling research, and social science qualitative investigations. We also believe that we need a better understanding of how different actors and institutions are affected by the SDGs and how this again leads to progress towards achieving these goals. So the causality chains, the pathways need to be better understood, and we need better methods for that. And overall, we also found that despite a growing number of researchers, and I think that many who listen to this plenary here today are part of this growing community of researchers looking into these issues, that we're still lacking data. And particularly, we lack data at the local level in many, many countries, and also is particular on developing countries, especially least developed countries, where we have a huge lacuna in the data that we need, that we would need to really understand whether the SDGs have advanced sustainability since 2015. So overall, we came to the conclusion, bring it all together, that the SDGs had thus far, that's very important, in 2021, the SDGs had thus far only limited political effects in global governance and national governance and in local governance. We observed considerable discursive effects, and also there might have been some change when it comes to normative institutional reform, but only limited there. There's surely some mutual learning among governments, of course, in the Heidelberg Political Forum. The SDGs also offer new instruments for local actors to hold governments accountable, maybe also to gain more support from governments, from funding agencies, international funding agencies in particular. There might be some new role for civil society that might be empowered by the SDGs in certain countries and certain regions. But nonetheless, the SDGs are surely not yet a transformative force in and of themselves. It's not that the world has substantially changed in any respect because the United Nations have agreed on the 17 SDGs in 2015. We found little evidence that any institutions are being realigned, unsustainable institutions are being realigned. We found little evidence for new funding for sustainable development and reallocation of funds at local, national, and global level. We didn't find much evidence that policies are becoming more coherent and more stringent in any place and geography. And we did not see that laws and programs are becoming more stringent and new laws and programs are being established to advance sustainability because of the SDGs. So overall, our conclusions are to some extent pessimistic, and there are not a huge endorsement that the SDGs have been a major success story since 2015. The world has not substantially and fundamentally changed because of the SDGs. So the question is a bit the old question, of course, of the glass that is half full or half empty. They're optimists. And some of us are part of these optimists that say that, of course, our assessment has been done in 2021. So only in the first 5-6 years into the operation of the SDGs. And so that a lot of this discursive change that we observed might actually lead to structural change in the next 9 years. Pessimists would say, well, looking at the timeline from 2015 to 2021, if there should be any major transformative force of the SDGs, it would have happened already, and the seeds of a stronger transformation should have been already visible right now and detectable in the literature that we assessed. So therefore, we have 9 years to go, and it is up to the audience and the participants to decide whether you're optimist and pessimist. So far, not that much has happened. Maybe more is happening in 9 years, we don't know, and we hope. The Global Goals Impact Assessment, the Sustainable Development Goals as a transformative force, will be published by Cambridge University Press around March 2022. It will be published as an open access book. That means the entire book, but also all individual chapters can be downloaded from the Cambridge University website at any point, at any time, for free. And we hope that this means of open access publishing will help make the insights of our book more accessible to colleagues and activists and practitioners all over the world. We have concluded the impact assessment fully, so the text has been sent to the copy editors, and we will continue starting to tweet about it in the months to come after the summer break. And we look very much forward to your insights, your comments on this, and also to your continuous engagement and research on the Sustainable Development Goals in the years to come. So our assessment brings a mix of optimism and pessimism, and we're looking forward to your comments, and I look forward to your questions today here at this plenary session. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to your comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Biermann. I think it took almost 30 minutes for the presentation, but we are grateful for that insightful presentation. So we open the floor for 10 minutes questions. So if somebody have a question, a comment, you're welcome. Probably I'll ask the first question. Looking at SDGs, and I mean, you mentioned about steering effect. I don't know whether you, in your research, you kind of categorize or look at the difference when it comes to the developed world and that of the developing, or that of Africa specifically. To what extent do we say we have the steering effect of SDGs on policy for Africa? Please, can you unmute yourself?
Okay, no, I was unmuted, so I'm now unmuted by the host also. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you so much for this question. As I said, our work is based on a literature review, and there is not that much research, in particular on Africa. That is one of our findings, in particular when we look at the topic of inclusiveness, but also on the multi-level governance and the effects that the SDGs might have had. And we didn't find that much literature on this particular region. But overall, the finding is that across the board, in many, many countries, there are not that many steering effects of the SDGs so far. So it's not that we have found that many governments that have changed substantially their policies, or that have substantially changed their institutional arrangements, or that have substantially changed their organizational setups because of the SDGs. So these kind of changes we rarely detected. And we rarely detected also changes in terms of improvement of inclusiveness, no one leaving no one behind, and these important concerns of the Agenda 2030. Again, we found discursive changes, that actors are talking differently about these issues, that SDGs are being referred to, but we did not find that many changes so far. And this is also the case for Africa. It's also the case for SDG 10. That said that the overall inequality in global governance and global economic systems should be reduced, which is one of the requirements of SDG 10. Again, we didn't find many changes in the last 5 years that could be causally linked to the SDGs. Thank you.
Okay, there is a question here. Thank you for your answer. Someone wants to find out if the study or you try to assess the steering effect of SDGs. Why did you decide to rather review literature instead of interviewing the implementers of the SDGs?
Oh, that is a very good question. It is a matter of scale, I would say. So I think interviews are a fantastic research methodology. We couldn't do it because what we were relating on literature, but a lot of the literature is again referring to interviews. So in a sense, it's a two-scale process that a lot of the scientific literature that we reviewed used interviews as a research methodology and as a basis for their findings. And then we reviewed the findings of these scientific studies. So we did not conduct scientific research ourselves. We reviewed more than 3,000 articles that in one way or the other dealt with the impact of the SDGs, including interviews. But in general, I believe that interviews are a fantastic research methodology and encourage everybody to continue working on this. And then maybe at some point, the next assessment we can then include and refer to these studies that are about to appear.
Okay, great. There's a question here. Someone wants to know what should be changed to the HLPF. I'm not too sure what the acronym means, but probably you may know, so that it plays to its real role. So what should be changed to the HLPF so that it plays its real role?
Well, thank you so much. I mean, this is the high-level political forum on sustainable development, a new body within the United Nations system set up in 2000 and after the last Rio conference. And its main function today is to review the implementation of the SDGs. We studied the literature on the high-level political forum because one of the claims of the high-level political forum is that it would act in a way as an orchestrator, bring about change and helping to implement the SDGs. And we couldn't find a lot of impacts of the high-level political forum so far. So the original expectations, maybe they were naive, so I had high expectations on the high-level political forum, but these original expectations did not bear out. So the question is, what else could be done better? Originally, there were some ideas in the process leading to the last Rio conference in 2012 to have a high-level institutional board in the UN system at a much higher structural level. And this would mean to make it an organizational part, a body in the United Nations system. There were some people who argued in favor of a council on sustainable development at the highest possible level. So these are some of the ideas that have been out, and I think this is the direction to move forward to change the structure of the high-level political forum and make it a more powerful, a stronger body in the UN system because of sustainability to considerations that are so important. I think that's an important part of the reform strategy for the United Nations system.
This question comes from Ruth. Yes, she said that you said the policy change was mainly led by subnational and non-state actors. So do you think that those actors are using the SDGs as advocacy tool, as you suggest civil society actors?
Very good question. And I fully agree with the question, actually, who has asked it, the person who asked it. Thanks so much. We found substantial evidence that SDGs have an impact at the local level. There are a lot of studies that show changes at the level of city government, cities, NGOs, civil society at the local level, where local actors are picking up the SDGs and try to use them to push governmental actors at the local, regional, and national level forward. So there we find that the SDGs are being used by some actors, civil society actors, local actors, to hold governments and other actors more accountable. So this is one of the positive impacts. And sometimes I believe that the impact at the local, the city level, is maybe one of the biggest impacts that the SDGs had so far in certain areas. And I think this is a positive impact where global goals can have an impact at local governance, and this should be certainly all supported and further advanced.
One of the audience also wants to know that you sounded very skeptical, and so she wants to know if you think the SDGs can then live up to expectation.
Well, this is, of course, this is what I tried to symbolize in my last slide with the glass that is either half full or half empty. On the one hand, one could say, and this is what many of our researchers also have said, that our conclusions are maybe too pessimistic because it's only 5 or 6 years. And technically also because our main methodology is literature review. A lot of the literature that we reviewed has been written actually, or the research is 2 years old. So it was about the first couple of years of the SDGs. So there's a lot of potential. There's a lot of action could still happen in the years to come till 2030. So this is a positive story and we can believe in that. On the other hand, I would also suspect that if the SDGs had a major impact or would have a major impact by 2030, a lot of change would have been observable already now. So governments would have, they had enough time in a sense. So since 2015, there were a couple of years where governments could have changed legislation, they could have changed institutional structures, they could have changed organizational arrangements, and this has not happened. So there's not that much evidence that governments really have taken the SDGs seriously. Business actors have discursive change, but also to the broad extent they're really taking them seriously. It's a big question. So I think a lot of change could have happened. It has not happened. So therefore, I'm not very bullish about the SDGs right now, but maybe I'm also proven wrong, and maybe in 10 years we write a beautiful and much more positive assessment. It's possible.
Okay. Any other questions from the audience? Okay. Okay, so somebody wants to know that do you see different steering effects produced by the SDGs versus those created by goals agendas that focus on climate / SDG 13 alone?
But SDG, it's a very good question. I think that SDG 13 is a very unique case in a way, because essentially it's a reference to the climate agreement. So whatever is happening on climate governance at the global level, but also at the national and local level, is largely related either to the climate convention or it is related to local and national climate action, which is also very, very important and very powerful. So I would not suspect that any climate policy in any country in Europe and Africa or wherever is related to SDG 13. So nobody implements a climate law or climate action because of SDG 13. So I think this is a goal that is very difficult to assess, and it probably doesn't have a major independent steering effect. So I think if you want to look for steering effects of the SDGs, one should not look to SDG 13. It was never meant to be like that. So on the other hand, I mean, some other goals might have had some other impacts. I mean, there might be some variation of the goals. They're also quite different in terms of their history. Some of them are older in a way, dating back to the Millennium Development Goals. Others are totally new, like SDG 10, SDG 16. So there is some variation, but overall, we could not find a lot of impact of these goals in national and local politics.
Okay, we have another question for you, Professor Biermann. Someone wants to know that if you study the VNRS, that view, sorry, did you study the VNR? What view do you have on them as follow-up documents of SDGs?
The answer to that is a very good question. It's a bit like the first answer. We did not study the VNRs per se, because we did literature review on studying reports, literature of others who have studied them. But here the finding is, well, I mentioned on one slide that there is some evidence for peer learning among governments. So this is one of the impacts. It's related to these reports where governments are reporting on their activities. These reports also can help NGOs, civil society, and other actors, also our governments, to hold actors to account. They provide a certain benchmark in a way, so they make government policies clearer, transparent to the extent that governments are reporting, actually, because there's also a lot of variation among governmental reports. So there is an impact in terms of peer learning and civil society holding governments accountable. On the other hand, I would say there's a mismatch between those impacts and the larger transformative change that we actually need to advance sustainability. So the rhetoric of the 2015 political process, the agenda and the SDGs is not matched by the little change that we find in these voluntary reports and the little change that we find in the peer learning processes.
Thank you very much, Prof. We are so grateful for your time. We would proceed with the next presenter. The next presenter is Andrea Ordóñez. She is the director of Sounding Voice, and she has been part of this initiative since 2012. She leads the implementation of the network strategy and the program. She has done a lot of work, and her work has been focusing on fostering better knowledge system to support sustainable development. This afternoon, she is presenting on the topic financial and institutional arrangement for the climate change and SDGs agenda. So we have you, Ms. Andrea, you have 50 minutes presentation, after which the audience would ask some few questions. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Benedicta. I'll start sharing my slides. Can you let me know if you can see them?
Yes.
Yeah, all right. Thank you very much for the invitation today, and it's great to be sharing the panel with Frank, given that it will build upon his presentation, and I hope mine will be more so of a provocation based a bit on the work that we've done together in the book and further research carried out through Southern Voice research agenda. Like I was mentioning at the beginning, and Frank also mentioned, I was involved in the particular chapter on multi-level implementation of the agenda, the review as part of what Frank presented before me, and also this presentation is based on the State of the SDGs report that is produced by Southern Voice, and Southern Voice is a network of over 50 think tanks across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And the review seeks to explore how the progress, how the SDGs is playing out in the regions where we work and where our members are located. And quite similar to what Frank had mentioned, through the chapter and also through a lot of research in the network, we look at changes that we want to see happen in different levels, and we would like to see these changes in discourse, in institutions, in financial arrangements, and also in new types of relationships and partnerships. While Frank has given an overview of a bit of how things are going throughout all of them from the book that we've been working on, I want to focus more on the institutional arrangements and the financial arrangements, and a bit more with some provocations based on the evidence that we've seen. So I'm not going to go too much into, exactly the evidence, but more reflections and things about how we could move forward and build on the previous presentation. Here we have a summary first of kind of like mapping out what is the scene of the institutional arrangements that we have, both for the Paris Agreement and for the 2030 Agenda. And this is a brief summary of what is expected at the global and at the national level for both agendas. And here are all the documents and spaces that we know are around the agenda. So just a quick reflections on these. The first one is that there are some parallels between both agendas. So there is some space for further coordination between them, because we are expecting governments to do documents that are planning them. We do expect them to be producing documents for tracking them. And there are also at the global level spaces for some sort of assessment or discussion of progress on these two agendas. Now, I want to build in from some of the findings shared earlier and some reflections from seeing how this has been evolving in countries in the global south. I think that for the institutional planning, the spaces for institutional planning in the global south, there is a lot that has been happening in the 2030 agenda. So we've done reviews of how have countries been planning to respond to the 2030 agenda, and we actually see that a lot of countries have put forward, some sort of coordination mechanism or organizing mechanism. So this could be central coordination offices. This could be within the planning ministries, an office within the Prime Minister office. There's like different types of arrangement, but most countries have done this work of setting up an initial institution. Many times it was based on the experience that they've had previously on the Millennium Development Goals as well. And one thing that is happening differently in the global south, and that may be different also from the global north, is that in a lot of these countries, the follow-up of the climate change is mostly done at the Ministry of Environmental level, and that may be limiting the political strength of that agenda within these different countries. This may be different. And this is more anecdotal than anything, to some other countries in the global north who had original institutions based on the Rio +20 process, which was environmentally led. So actually, the implementation of the SDGs and the institutional arrangements look somewhat different. But anyways, my point being that in terms of political relevance, these institutional arrangements are also defining differences between these two agendas, and I think it's something for us to reflect on how if we want a better coordination between these agendas, what can be done at this stage of where the agenda is sitting within the governments, and learning about options for that. And then my last reflection in terms of the institutional arrangements is that we see a lot and we hear a lot of comments about how they are disconnected at the national level. And I think we have to also acknowledge that they are still disconnected at the global level, right? So we need to also find the mechanisms of better integrating these processes at the global level if we want to also see those that coordination at the national level. Then in terms of the financial arrangements, we have very different things in terms of scope and in terms of strategies. So while the Paris Agreement, has more specific financial mechanisms, funds, and facilities that have been established for it, the 2030 Agenda is more broadly speaking about how to reorient the resources from private and public actors to the 2030 Agenda, and the agenda itself contains, discussion about taxation, illicit financial flows, ODA, South-South cooperation. So I think here it's also interesting that it gives us different challenges. I think that the challenge of the method, of the arrangements of methods for the Paris Agreement is going back to what in the development world we've been struggling with since the MDGs, which is like leaving out of projects, right? And thinking only about solutions in terms of projects that need to be financed. So that's, I think, the challenge of having these different funds and mechanisms thought out this way. Now, on the other hand, the 2030 Agenda in practice sounds better, because it's taking into consideration that all this funding needs to be reoriented, and that there is no one single bullet to finance the agenda. But like Frank was saying, it's very difficult to see if actually that reorientation is happening, and that also from the review that we've done in countries across the global south, we are in the same line from what Frank shared before, that it's there's very little changes in terms of budgeting. I mean, there's countries that have been doing the exercises of mapping the SDGs with their budgets and so on, but there's still less to say about whether they are really changing the way that finance is happening. So I think here it's about the different challenges that both strategies put for countries. So I think some of the key concerns from looking at these institutional and financial arrangements are whether we are, and I think this relates to some of the questions posed earlier, if we're seeing these global agendas more as tools that we want different actors to use in the way they are working, or whether we're looking at them as rules that they have to follow, right? And I think that a lot of the time when we're discussing them, we're seeing them more like rules that are meant to be followed, but then that limits maybe the possible use that the agendas could have as tools for creativity, for more new types of relationships and partnerships. Like I was saying earlier in the section on institutional arrangements, I think there's these for climate, but I think it relates also to other sectors. There is the question about how do we connect the specific actions, the technical aspects of progressing in different areas of sustainable development within a general framework, right? So it's kind of tricky because we don't want to miss the specificity needed at the technical level. For example, in the case of climate that the environmental industry has, but we would like it to in the political discussion be at the level of relevance of sustainable development as a whole, right? So I think that is the other concern. And finally, that I think if we maintain these fragmentation at the global level of funds, of different requirements, we will still see this fragmentation also at the national level. So the question is whether there are any opportunities for us to streamline those at the global level. And this might be this might be quite difficult, but it's good to acknowledge that there is that link between what is happening at the global level, the structures at the global level, and what we end up seeing play out at the national level. And then to finalize, I wanted to bring some thinking about possible reflections and opportunities. And I think it's important to remember that while it might be a little bit challenging, and Frank mentioned this because there's not a lot of knowledge about what are the steering effects of the SDGs, or we have problems with doing research in this area and on having the right data and evidence. We do have certain things that we can learn from the implementation of the Millennium Development Goals. There are things that we can learn from the processes of discussing development cooperation, development effectiveness, that have been going on for much longer than the SDGs. And the Paris Agreement. And there is a difference that these agendas were previously only thought of for the Global South, and so they might not be in the radar of all of us when looking at them. But I think it's important to keep in mind that they've been there and that we can learn from them. And I think one in particular that we can really learn from is all the discussions that have been going on around the effectiveness of official development assistance and aid, and there are spaces to learn from those previous agendas for the SDGs and the Paris Agreement, while we wait for new and better evidence on these newer agendas. So I think that the one thing that we know from the development effectiveness discourse, from the relationship between recipient and development and donor countries, is that there was this expectation that there would be mutual accountability within countries. And I think that is something that we've taken forward with all these new agendas, with the SDGs and also with the Paris Agreement, that they are in a sense creating a mutual accountability between countries. But we know that there is a limit there, and so the question is if and through the effort that civil society organizations do and other actors do, if there are better ways of integrating those global agendas into where the real accountability is, which is within the political systems of each country. Because I think we've seen so far many times already that this mutual accountability between countries has its limits, right? So it might be too much to ask for it to be the only way forward. Also, we know from the past that ownership remains critical, and that this is a concern when we have a lot of political transitions in different countries. I remember that in some of the reviews that we did in 2019, that was a main concern, because some of the first governments that had signed the SDGs where there was a change in government. So the question is, are the institutions strong enough to keep them, and so on. So it's the question of is there ownership at the national and local level is very important, and I think it relates also to the question before about the active role of civil society and local actors, that it's at that level that you can really start owning the agenda. And so that is another critical aspect that we know is there, that has been important in the past, and that would be important for the future. And the final one is that like I was saying before, there's this challenge that the financial tools will end up driving the rest of the things. The financial tools will drive the types of institutions, the type of relationships and partnerships that are put in place, and we know this also from the previous experiences of development effectiveness, that it's very different to provide in budget support, to do projects, to do sectorial funds or vertical funds. So I think that that's the other thing where we have space to learn and reflect on whether we can think about some more creative tools for finance, knowing that these ones should, it's not only about giving out the funds, but to ensure that these tools actually support the institutional arrangements and the ownership that is required for the success of these agendas. So those are some reflections from my side. Like I said, they're based on some of the thinking that has happened in preparation for the book that also Frank present on, our report on the state of the SDGs, and further research that that some of our partners have been carrying out as well. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrea, for your presentation. So we now open the floor for discussion. Yeah, any question? You can raise your hand and make your submission by using the icon on the Zoom, or you post your question on the chat box. Yeah, so any question from the audience?
We have one from John.
Okay, we have a question here. I do think that the COP26 will bring more coherence in the Paris Agreement as far as the SDGs are concerned.
Well, that's a very good question, but I'm not as much a follower of the Paris process as I would like or should be. But I think that there's this space on. I think that the option of bringing them together may require some specific space at the global level. And I think that Stockholm Plus 50 that we are gearing up for next June may be that space. And I know that, it's an interesting setup where it's Sweden plus Kenya hosting it, which is a nice balance of countries. There is already discussions about how to include some of the principles within the SDGs, like leave no one behind, within the climate discussions. So I think it's an interesting opportunity, and I also value it because it's kind of like independent between both processes itself. So I think it might be a good approach.
Yeah, okay. Any other question from the audience?
I think there's one before.
Hi, Chair Benedicta. This is John Thompson. That was my question.
Okay.
And it was really coming back to Andrea's point about this concern about fragmentation. at that global scale and how that translates to implementation, tensions in implementation and coordination at national level, which we're seeing in many contexts. There's so many demands on national governments and their partners to implement all of these international commitments, agreements of different sorts, to be reporting against all these indicators that have been set and so on. And while that is there to support that accountability and transparency, it can easily become a box ticking exercise as opposed to being useful for steering, as you've been describing, steering processes towards more sustainable and equitable outcomes. And I have seen, in the case of, coming back to Benedicta's question about Africa, there in the African context, the African Union has tried to align the Comprehensive Africa Agriculture Development Program commitments, the CAADP commitments around transforming African agriculture, and the SDGs. And they sat down several years ago to look at both of those commitments and say, where do we see complementarities? Where do we see some tensions? How do we bring these together so that governments can look at them in the whole? And then when they're operationalizing one, in a sense, they're operationalizing both. And I think that there's still the limited effect that Frank was talking about earlier, but I nevertheless think that that was a very useful exercise at a quite strategic level, at a regional scale. And I'm just wondering what the opportunities are, or are you aware of other opportunities where something along those lines has happened elsewhere at regional level or national level and so on? Thank you.
Well, I think there's been some cases where at least the exercise of seeing the interconnections between the different issues of the agendas, and particularly between the climate agenda and the SDGs has been taken forward in different countries, like exercises like these within governments like Sri Lanka, for example. But I think I haven't encountered yet, and it would be great if someone had a good case study of something where there is a country where the institution or the space in charge of the SDGs is the same one that is in charge of the climate agreement. And I think in the global south, I haven't seen that same kind of framing. What we've seen more is this division between the environmental ministry and another interministerial space for the SDGs. And I think maybe one of the ways of doing this more broadly could be that within the Paris Agreement, a way of putting some of those discussions at the political level within that same space where the 2030 agenda is, and then keeping that technical follow-up, which in all of the SDGs as well can be quite complex to do at another ministerial level. So it might be an approach moving forward.
Okay, thank you. Just a question here for you. Can you relate some examples where the SDGs have already led to positive outcome in some global south countries? That's from Joseph.
That's a really good question. Well, I think this is also quite related to what Frank was mentioning before. I think that the adoption of the framing of the SDGs by local actors has been very interesting, that there are, cities that are interested in adopting this framework moving forward, and also that they're able to, in that process, put forward the types of partnerships that are envisioned in the process, right? So I think what we were looking at when we were reading the literature is that it's when the partnerships, the convenings seem to be, led or coordinated by subnational governments or by other actors, they seem to be bringing interesting change, more so than when they're being led by the national governments. But I'm not so sure if I can share a specific example off the top of my head right now.
Thank you very much. We have 2 minutes to go. If there's anyone with a last question. If there are none, I would want to thank Andrea very much for the presentation, and also thank Professor Frank Biermann for their time and also for their presentation. We are so grateful. I want to also thank the audience for the great question being posed in order to seek more clarification. So we'll bring this session to an end, and we would reconvene 30 minutes from this time to other parallel sections. So thank you so much for your time, and do have a nice afternoon. See you later. Yeah, bye.
Thank you, everyone. Okay. Hi, everyone. As we just wait for people to come in, I'm going to just share some housekeeping slides. So my name is Fiona Hurd. I am the program manager for SSRP and the technical facilitator for this session. So this is the final session of day 2 for the Evidence for Action Symposium. Welcome. Thank you for making it to the end of the day. House rules, you're probably familiar with these already, but we'll just touch base